The morning frost clung to the hills above the Hudson River as the last of General John Burgoyne's army woke to a sound no British soldier wanted to hear. Silence. No supply wagons creaking up from the south. No word from Sir Henry Clinton's promised relief force in New York. Just the distant murmur of thousands of American voices surrounding them on three sides, and the slow, grinding certainty that there was nowhere left to march. It was the second week of October 1777, and an army that had once numbered nearly 8,000 men, an army that had crossed Lake Champlain in June with bands playing and banners unfurled, an army that British newspapers had confidently predicted would slice the rebellious colonies in two, now huddled in shallow trenches near a place called Saratoga, eating half rations, burying their dead in unmarked pits, and listening to American cannon fire creep closer every day. Horses lay dead and bloated in the mud, shot for meat or killed by artillery, their carcasses left to rot because no one had the strength to bury them. Wounded men groaned in makeshift hospital tents that offered no real shelter from the autumn rain. And John Burgoyne, a man celebrated in London drawing rooms for his wit, his gambling, and his confidence, sat in his headquarters and stared at maps that told him what his instincts had already confirmed. He was trapped. Behind him, the Americans held the fords across the Hudson. Ahead of him, entrenchments bristled with riflemen who had already proven, twice, that they could stop his best troops cold. There would be no glorious breakout, no relief column arriving in the nick of time. In a matter of days, Burgoyne would do something no British general had ever done in the history of the Empire's wars in North America. He would surrender an entire army. To understand how one of the most respected military forces in the world found itself starving and surrounded in the forests of upstate New York, we have to go back to the winter before, to a plan drawn up in London by men who had never set foot in the American wilderness, and who badly underestimated what that wilderness, and the people fighting to defend it, were capable of. By late 1776, the American Revolution had already dragged on far longer than British ministers had expected. Washington's army had suffered devastating losses around New York City, but had also delivered stunning surprises at Trenton and Princeton, keeping the rebellion alive when many in London assumed it was finished. Frustrated by the stalemate, British strategists turned to a plan that looked on paper elegantly simple. New England, particularly Massachusetts, was viewed as the ideological heart of the rebellion, the place where the Sons of Liberty had first organized, where the shots at Lexington and Concord had been fired. If New England could be severed from the other colonies, the thinking went, the rebellion could be starved of its most committed fighters and its supply of men and material. The instrument for this plan was geography itself. A chain of lakes and rivers ran almost continuously from Canada down to New York City. Lake Champlain, Lake George, and the Hudson River, forming a natural highway through otherwise impassable forest and mountain terrain. If a British army could march down this corridor from Canada, while another force pushed up the Hudson from New York City, meeting somewhere near Albany, the two colonies of New England could theoretically be isolated from Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the South. The man chosen to lead the southern thrust from Canada was John Burgoyne, a 54-year-old lieutenant general known as much for his flair as his tactics. Burgoyne was a playwright and a member of Parliament, as well as a soldier, a man who cut a dashing figure in London society, and who had earned the nickname Gentleman Johnny for his relatively humane treatment of his own soldiers, and his taste for comfort, even on campaign. He had served with distinction in Europe during the 7 Years' War, commanding light cavalry with real skill, and he had already spent time in America, present at the failed British attempt to take Boston in 1775. Burgoyne was ambitious. He had lobbied hard in London for this command, believing it offered the chance for the kind of decisive, war-ending victory that could make his reputation permanent. He was talented, confident, and, as events would prove, dangerously overconfident about what an 18th-century European-style army, complete with heavy artillery, elaborate baggage trains, and even the wives and mistresses of officers, could accomplish moving through dense American forest. If you're the kind of viewer who appreciates history, told with real depth and care for the evidence, this is a good moment to subscribe, because the deeper we go into this campaign, the more remarkable and the more tragic it becomes. Burgoyne's force set out from Canada in June 1777, moving down Lake Champlain in an impressive flotilla of boats, roughly 7,700 British and German soldiers, supported by artillery, along with hundreds of Canadian militia, Loyalist volunteers, and several hundred Native American allies, mostly from Iroquois nations, recruited to serve as scouts and raiders. The campaign began with a genuine triumph. Fort Ticonderoga, the strategic fortress the Americans had held since seizing it early in the war, fell to Burgoyne in early July 1777, almost without a fight, after British and German engineers managed to haul artillery up a nearby height called Sugarloaf Hill, a position the Americans had believed inaccessible to heavy guns. Once British cannon appeared looking down into the fort, the American garrison under General Arthur St. Clair had no choice but to abandon the position overnight. The fall of Ticonderoga sent shockwaves through the colonies and briefly seemed to confirm every optimistic assumption in London. King George III reportedly burst into Queen Charlotte's chambers, exclaiming that he had beaten the Americans. But Ticonderoga's fall, dramatic as it looked, would prove to be the high point of Burgoyne's campaign and the beginning of a slow, grinding disaster. South of Ticonderoga, the geography turned against Burgoyne in ways his plan had not adequately accounted for. The route toward the Hudson ran through dense forest, swampland, and a landscape crossed by numerous streams, all of which needed bridging for Burgoyne's army to move its artillery and enormous baggage train. General Philip Schuyler, commanding American forces in the region, understood that he could not yet defeat Burgoyne in open battle, so he adopted a strategy of delay and destruction. American soldiers felled thousands of trees across the roads Burgoyne needed, dammed streams to create flooding, destroyed bridges, and drove off livestock that might have fed the British Army. What should have taken Burgoyne days took weeks. It took his army 24 days to cover roughly 23 miles from Skenesboro to Fort Edward, an agonizingly slow crawl that gave the Americans priceless time to gather militia, organize supplies, and prepare defenses. Every day of delay was a day Burgoyne's own supplies dwindled, a day his horses grew weaker, a day the initiative slipped further from his hands. It was during this grinding advance that an event occurred which would do more damage to the British cause than any single battle. In late July 1777, a young woman named Jane McCrea, engaged to marry a Loyalist officer serving with Burgoyne's army, was killed near Fort Edward, apparently by Native American warriors allied with the British, under circumstances that remain somewhat disputed among historians even today. Though most accounts agree she was killed and scalped by warriors escorting her toward the British lines, possibly amid confusion or a dispute over her custody. The exact details are not fully verifiable, but the effect of her death was not in doubt. American propagandists seized on the story immediately, transforming Jane McCrea into a symbol of British and Native brutality against innocent civilians. Newspapers throughout the colonies printed and reprinted the story, often with embellishments, portraying a peaceful young woman en route to her wedding, murdered by the very allies the British had brought into the war. The killing terrified frontier families, who had been wavering on whether to support the rebellion or remain neutral, and it became one of the most effective pieces of propaganda of the entire war, driving furious New England and New York militiamen to rally to the American cause in numbers that dramatically strengthened the forces gathering to oppose Burgoyne. Burgoyne himself was appalled by the killing and initially considered executing the warrior responsible, but was persuaded by his own officers that doing so risked losing Native American support entirely, a decision that satisfied no one and only compounded the political damage. The employment of Native American allies, intended by British planners to terrorize the frontier into submission and provide invaluable scouting capability, instead became a recruiting tool for the very rebellion it was meant to crush. By late summer, Burgoyne's difficulties were compounding. He had sent a detachment of nearly 900 Hessian soldiers and Loyalist troops toward Bennington in the New Hampshire grants, an area in what is now Vermont, hoping to seize horses, cattle, and supplies desperately needed by his undersupplied army. Instead, on August 16, 1777, this detachment was intercepted and virtually destroyed by New Hampshire and Vermont militia under General John Stark at what became known as the Battle of Bennington. A relief column sent to support the retreating Hessians was also badly mauled. Burgoyne lost close to 1,000 men in this single, costly failure, a devastating blow to an army that could not afford to lose soldiers it had no way of replacing so deep in hostile territory. Around the same time, a separate British column under Colonel Barry St. Leger, which had been advancing from the west along the Mohawk Valley as a supporting arm of the overall campaign, was forced to abandon its siege of Fort Stanwix and retreat back to Canada after a fierce battle at Oriskany and growing pressure from American forces, including a relief expedition partly organized by Benedict Arnold, who spread exaggerated rumors of overwhelming American numbers to unsettle St. Leger's Native American allies, many of whom subsequently abandoned the siege. With St. Leger's retreat, the planned three-pronged convergence on Albany had effectively collapsed before it truly began. Burgoyne was now advancing alone. If you find yourself wondering how differently this campaign might have unfolded had British coordination between these separate forces been stronger, you're asking exactly the kind of question historians have debated for more than 2 centuries, and I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments. In August 1777, American command in the Northern Theater changed hands. The Continental Congress, frustrated by the loss of Ticonderoga and eager for a more aggressive leader, replaced General Philip Schuyler with General Horatio Gates. Gates was an experienced soldier, a former British officer who had settled in Virginia before the Revolution and thrown his support behind the American cause. He was methodical, cautious, and highly attentive to the political dimensions of command, skills that would serve the American cause well in the coming weeks, even as his caution would later draw criticism. Gates inherited an army bolstered enormously by the aftermath of Jane McCrea's death and the victory at Bennington, with militia streaming in from New England and New York in numbers that swelled his forces to roughly 7,000 men, soon growing further as more units arrived. Crucially, Gates also had at his disposal 2 of the most capable battlefield commanders in the Continental Army, Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan. Benedict Arnold, before his name became synonymous with treason, was one of the finest field commanders America had. Aggressive, physically courageous to the point of recklessness, and deeply respected by the soldiers who served under him, Arnold had already distinguished himself in the failed invasion of Canada and in the delaying naval action at Valcour Island in 1776, which, though a tactical defeat, had bought critical time for American forces to prepare. Daniel Morgan commanded a specialized corps of riflemen, mostly frontiersmen from Virginia and Pennsylvania, armed with long rifles far more accurate than the standard military musket, though slower to reload. Morgan's men were experts at the kind of irregular, cover-based fighting the dense American terrain rewarded, and they would prove instrumental in the fighting to come, particularly in targeting British officers, whose distinctive uniforms and positions leading their men made them visible and vulnerable. Gates positioned his growing army on Bemis Heights, a commanding ridge overlooking the Hudson River and the road Burgoyne needed to take toward Albany, and set his engineers, including the Polish military engineer Thaddeus Kosciuszko, to fortifying the position with entrenchments and artillery emplacements. It was a strong defensive position, chosen with real skill, forcing Burgoyne to either attack fortified ground or attempt a difficult flanking maneuver through the forest to the west. On September 19, 1777, Burgoyne made his move, attempting to probe and turn the American left flank near a clearing known as Freeman's Farm. What followed was one of the most fiercely contested engagements of the entire war. Benedict Arnold, sensing the danger to the American position, pressed Gates for permission to send troops forward to meet the British advance in the open, rather than wait passively behind the entrenchments. Gates, cautious by temperament, was reluctant, but eventually allowed Arnold to commit forces, including Morgan's riflemen and Henry Dearborn's light infantry. The fighting at Freeman's Farm raged for hours across the clearing and the surrounding woods, with control of the field shifting back and forth as British regiments, including troops under General Simon Fraser, one of Burgoyne's most capable subordinates, fought desperately to hold their ground against repeated American assaults. Morgan's riflemen inflicted brutal casualties on British officers, and by the close of fighting, Burgoyne technically held the field, but at a staggering cost, roughly 600 British and German casualties compared to around 300 American losses. It was the kind of victory that could not be repeated. Burgoyne's army, already weakened by disease, desertion, and dwindling supplies, could not sustain losses at that rate and hoped to reach Albany with any fighting force left intact. In the days after Freeman's Farm, tensions within the American camp exploded into the open. Gates, in his official report to Congress, made no mention of Arnold's crucial role in the battle. a slight Arnold found infuriating given how directly his initiative had shaped the outcome. The two men, whose personalities and command styles had always sat uneasily together, Gates the careful administrator, Arnold the aggressive battlefield tactician, fell into open conflict. Gates stripped Arnold of his field command, and for a time, Arnold remained in camp essentially without an official role, seething at what he saw as a betrayal after the sacrifices his troops had made. Meanwhile, Burgoyne's situation grew steadily more desperate. He had been counting on a promised advance up the Hudson by Sir Henry Clinton's forces from New York City to relieve pressure and potentially link up with his own army. Clinton did launch an offensive in early October, capturing several American forts along the Hudson Highlands. But the effort came too late and fell far short of reaching Burgoyne, who by this point had no reliable communication with Clinton's forces at all. Burgoyne's supplies were running critically low. His men were on reduced rations. Desertions were mounting among his Canadian and Loyalist auxiliaries, and many of his Native American allies, judging the campaign lost, had already departed for home. Winter was approaching, and Burgoyne faced an agonizing choice: retreat back toward Canada, admitting the campaign's failure, or make one final attempt to break through the American position and reach Albany. Before we continue into the campaign's final, decisive days, if this kind of carefully researched military history is something you value, take a moment to like this video. It genuinely helps this channel keep producing work like this. On October 7th, 1777, Burgoyne chose to attack, sending a reconnaissance in force of roughly 1,500 men to probe the American left and determine whether a route around Gates's position might still be found. This decision led to the Battle of Bemis Heights, sometimes called the Second Battle of Saratoga, and it would prove catastrophic for the British Army. Gates responded by ordering Daniel Morgan's riflemen and other units to attack the British flanks, and Benedict Arnold, still technically without formal command, but unable to remain passive while battle raged, rode out onto the field regardless, rallying troops and personally leading assaults with the kind of reckless courage that had made his reputation. Whether Arnold's actions that day were sanctioned by Gates remains a point of some historical debate, but there is little dispute that his presence and leadership on the field galvanized American attacks at critical moments. American forces overran a key British fortified position known as the Bremen Redoubt, a defeat that exposed Burgoyne's entire right flank and effectively broke the integrity of his defensive line. During the fighting, General Simon Fraser, one of the most respected and capable officers in Burgoyne's army, was mortally wounded, reportedly targeted deliberately by one of Morgan's riflemen, who recognized his importance to British command and morale. Fraser's death, along with the loss of the Bremen Redoubt, left Burgoyne's position untenable. Arnold himself was severely wounded in the same leg injured earlier in the war during the assault, a wound serious enough that some surgeons initially considered amputation, though Arnold refused. With his lines broken and casualties mounting, Burgoyne had no choice but to withdraw his army to fortified positions near the village of Saratoga itself. But the retreat brought no relief. Gates's forces, swollen now to more than double Burgoyne's remaining strength, encircled the British position on three sides, with American artillery able to reach nearly every part of the shrinking British camp. It was in this grinding, hopeless entrapment, described at the very opening of this story, that Burgoyne's officers began to recognize what their commander himself could no longer avoid facing. There was no escape route left. There was no relief column coming in time. There was, in the most literal military sense, no way out. On October 13th, 1777, Burgoyne convened a council of war with his senior officers, who unanimously agreed that surrender negotiations were the only remaining option that did not amount to the pointless slaughter or starvation of the army. Negotiations between Burgoyne and Gates began the following day and continued for several tense days, complicated by lingering, unfounded rumors reaching Burgoyne's camp that Clinton's relief force might still be approaching, hopes that ultimately proved false. Gates, for his part, was eager to conclude terms quickly, partly out of legitimate concern that Clinton's forces really might arrive and complicate the situation, and the terms he offered were notably generous, reflecting both this urgency and a degree of contemporary military courtesy extended to a defeated but honorably fighting adversary. The resulting agreement, signed on October 17, 1777, was deliberately called a convention rather than a surrender, a face-saving distinction that mattered enormously to British honor. Under the Convention of Saratoga, Burgoyne's army, numbering just under 6,000 men by that point, would lay down its arms, but would technically be permitted to return to Britain on the condition its soldiers not serve again in North America during the war. In practice, the Continental Congress later refused to honor this provision, fearing, not without some justification, that released soldiers would simply free up other British troops for American service elsewhere, and most of Burgoyne's so-called Convention Army spent years in captivity in America, an outcome that added a bitter postscript to an already devastating defeat. The scene of the formal surrender, on October 17, 1777, carried its own quiet, aching symbolism. Burgoyne, dressed in his finest scarlet uniform, presented his sword to Gates, who, in a gesture widely praised at the time as a mark of genuine respect between professional soldiers, returned it to him immediately. Gates had also given orders that American troops remain out of sight as the defeated British and German soldiers marched out to lay down their weapons, sparing them the added humiliation of jeering or triumphant crowds, a decision that reflected the complicated mixture of hostility and mutual respect that often existed between 18th-century professional armies even in the midst of a revolutionary war. British and German soldiers filed past, stacking muskets, while their own regimental bands, in a moment noted by several eyewitnesses, played somber music, a final note of dignity amid catastrophic defeat. The consequences of Saratoga rippled outward from that Hudson Valley clearing, with a speed and force that transformed the entire character of the war. News of Burgoyne's surrender reached Paris in early December 1777, carried by the American diplomat Benjamin Franklin's associates, and it landed with electrifying impact. The French government under King Louis XVI had been quietly supplying the American war effort with money and material for some time, but it held back from open, formal alliance, wary of committing to a cause that might still collapse. Saratoga changed that calculation decisively. Here was proof, unmistakable and undeniable, that American forces could not merely survive against British arms, but could defeat and capture an entire British army in the field. Within weeks, French ministers moved toward formal negotiations with the American commissioners in Paris, and on February 6, 1778, France signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the United States, transforming what had been a colonial rebellion into a genuinely international war. Spain and the Dutch Republic would eventually be drawn into the conflict as well, stretching British military resources across multiple fronts and fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the war in America's favor. Saratoga's significance was never really about the tactical details of any single battle, though those details, the fighting at Freeman's farm, the desperate assault on the Brymon Redoubt, the death of Simon Fraser, Arnold's furious ride onto a battlefield he had no formal authority to command, remain some of the most dramatic moments of the entire Revolutionary War. Its true significance lay in what it proved to the wider world. A British army, professionally trained, well-equipped, led by an experienced general, had marched into the American interior and been systematically worn down, outmaneuvered, and ultimately forced into complete surrender by a combination of citizen militia, Continental regulars, skilled irregular fighters, and commanders willing to take extraordinary risks. Historians have long debated how much credit belongs to Gates's careful defensive strategy versus Arnold's aggressive battlefield leadership, a dispute that began among the participants themselves and has never fully been resolved. But there is no debate at all about the outcome's importance. Saratoga did not end the war. Years of hard fighting, hardship, and uncertainty still lay ahead for Washington's Continental Army. But it marked the moment the rebellion stopped looking to the watching courts of Europe like a desperate uprising destined to be crushed, and started looking like a war that could genuinely be won. Somewhere in the autumn mist over the Hudson River, in the silence of an army laying down its muskets, the entire trajectory of the American Revolution had quietly, irreversibly changed.